Well, it is a busy Peacock Alley that we come to you live and direct from tonight. Not quite as busy as last night. We're 2-hour waits last night, and people waited. That's how good the food is at the Peacock Alley tonight. It's Wine Down Wednesday, which means bottles of wine are half off, so a good reason to join us if you are around Bismarck, Mandan, to the Peacock Alley Grill and Bar, 422 East Main Avenue in the historic Patterson Building in downtown Bismarck. We welcome you to another edition of the Legislature Today radio show. Tonight's broadcast brought to you in part by the University of Mary, America's Leadership University. Also thank our hospitality sponsor, the Expressway Inn and Suites of Bismarck. You know, the Expressway hotels are near everything worth being near. Off I-94, exit 156 or exit 161, just 3 minutes from the airport, 3 blocks from the Civic Center, across from Kirkwood Shopping Mall, adjacent to the downtown area. So when in Bismarck, check out Luxury for Less at the Expressway Inn of Bismarck and the Expressway Inn Suites as well, and also that newly expanded and remodeled Expressway Lounge at the Expressway Suites of Bismarck, North Dakota. Well, Dale Wetzel is here, managing editor of the Legislature Today radio show, who has a question for me. What was that, Dale?
I was going to say you should mention that you stay at the Expressway Suites. So
I
it's
do
not,
indeed.
It's not, or Expressway Inn, I should say. So it's not. He's not just, you know, promoting the Expressway Inn because they paid us money. Scott likes to stay there.
It's my home away from home.
It's his home away from home.
Well, in Bismarck.
Another thing, you mentioned a 2-hour wait. I mean, if I could stay in a bar like this for 2 hours waiting for anything, I would. So it's not like a 2-hour wait is an imposition at the Peacock Alley.
I don't want to scare you off because it was a bit of an unusual, obviously, night last night to have those kind of waits, but it just tells you any restaurant where you'll wait 2 hours to eat tells you it's a pretty good restaurant.
Especially if it's in Bismarck, North Dakota. That means it's outstanding. Worth
the wait. So anyway, and hope you get a chance to take it in. If not tonight, any night here at the Peacock. Anyway, what happened in the Legislature today, Dale?
Well, there's a couple of bills I wanted to dwell on. First of them, the first one is an attempt to raise the North Dakota minimum wage. Actually, what this bill would do would be to index the minimum wage to inflation every year. There would be an increase in the minimum wage every year depending on whether the inflation rate merited it. Right now, North Dakota's minimum wage is $7.25. That's the same as the federal minimum. And I think it's fair to say that most folks, especially in the big cities, are not being paid the minimum wage. They're being paid more than that. And so the argument might be, okay, it's easy to raise. There's no pain in raising the minimum wage because everyone's being paid more than that. No harm. No, there's nothing wrong with it. What the argument might be from the other side is that the minimum wage may be something that is more common in rural North Dakota where the wages are lower and maybe the competition for labor is less intense. But we will see if that has legs. I mean, this does not advocate an increase in the North Dakota minimum wage other than an adjustment for inflation every year. There are some states that have a minimum wage that is higher than the federal minimum, quite a bit higher. There have been debates in the legislature in previous years about a concept called the living wage, which is essentially fixed according to the cost of living for a family of 4 that requires certain amenities. But this would raise the minimum wage every year according to inflation. And right now, the Department of Labor has the authority to revisit the question of what the state minimum wage is every year. But it hasn't done that for quite some time because, frankly, the officialdom in North Dakota is fairly comfortable with keeping the federal minimum wage. And we'll just see what kind of legs this bill has. I mean, it is a Democratic-sponsored bill. There are 8 Democrats on it. There are no Republicans. The primary sponsor is Fargo Representative Steve Zeiser of Fargo. We also had a rather interesting bit of legislation that would set aside $10 million for a film promotion fund. And this money would be taken from the Tobacco Settlement Trust Fund, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment. But the film fund would concentrate upon aiding the production of films about recipients of the Theodore Roosevelt Rough Rider Award. And there's a number of those, as you know, some of them, Phil Jackson, the former coach of the Los Angeles Lakers and the Chicago Bulls. I have Larry Wywoody, who's a famous novelist and poet. Recently, we've had R.D. Offutt, a businessman in eastern North Dakota.
Former university presidents. Dr. Tom Clifford is one I can think of off the top of my head.
Indeed, Dr. Tom Clifford. And also
Doug Burgum
and what I was going to sneak in is Bill Marseal Sr.
That's right.
The owner of, the chairman of Forum Communications, which is frankly the most significant media company in North Dakota.
My former boss, I was in the room when he received the award. It was a total surprise. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I'm glad it was a total surprise to him. Anyway.
Those are the best ones, don't you think, when it's a surprise?
Well, I question whether it was really a surprise. I think he was acting. But we'll
save that debate for another day. But the idea of this fund then would be to tell their stories on film, basically?
Well, it would be to provide the financing to do that. I mean, that's the implication of the language of the bill. It would come from the Tobacco Settlement Trust Fund, which was created in 1999 after attorneys general in 46 states, including North Dakota, and our current U.S. Senator Heidi Heitkamp was the attorney general at that time, negotiated a settlement with the four largest tobacco companies in the United States at the time, essentially to compensate states for their costs in medical treatment and care of people who smoke. The theory is that there is a certain taxpayer cost that is imposed by people who use tobacco, and that the tobacco companies should pay for this. Well, North Dakota, at the time, it was estimated North Dakota would get approximately $866 million over 25 years from this settlement. That amount's going to be a bit lower because smoking has declined, and the payments are pegged to tobacco usage to some extent. But the question will become, right now, the tobacco settlement money is divided primarily amongst funds that benefit schools, benefit water projects, benefit health projects. There's also a segment, there's also a segment that's put aside strictly for tobacco control and prevention. This was done because of an initiated measure that was spearheaded by Heidi Heitkamp a few years ago. And so the question becomes, is it an appropriate use of tobacco settlement funds to finance motion picture production, whatever the subject may be? And I suspect that will be one of the big debates of it. And also, there's $10 million is a pretty good chunk of change for film promotion in North Dakota. I mean, film promotion in North Dakota kind of got a jolt back in whenever it was that Dances with Wolves was made, the Kevin Costner film that showed him cavorting with buffalo in South Dakota.
That led to Woolly Boys, right?
Yes.
Is that before or after?
Well, Woolly Boys is after.
Yeah, okay.
Much after.
Anyway, that'll be an interesting one to follow, to see what happens there, to see if that funds end up going there. And certainly the Rough Rider Awards, if you've not been to the Capitol, it's fascinating to walk the hallways there and see the portraits and read the stories of all those storied Rough Rider recipients, for sure. You'll
notice that they've gotten too long. The little plaques, the people who got in first, they had nice, brief little summaries of their careers. Now you have something that's, much too long, in my opinion.
Novel.
and it's stuck there on the wall, and you see people sitting there trying to read it. I was also going to mention another of the bills that was discussed today was one that we're going to be talking about in a moment with our guests here. It's a tuition freeze for the next 2 years at North Dakota's public colleges. And that bill is sponsored by Representative Kylie Overson. She's a Democrat from Grand Forks, a new legislator. She's serving in her first session, and she is a former student body president at the University of North Dakota. And her district, District 42, includes the University of North Dakota.
And she's here. Welcome.
And she's with us, and along with Dr. Larry Scogan, who is the president of Bismarck State College, and a former administrator at the New Mexico Military Institute, I believe. He's a native of Hettinger, and he's been the president at BSC for approximately 6 years. And he's here to talk about the bill as well. Representative Overson, could you were at the hearing today. Could you just explain to us what happened and what were the arguments for and against?
Yep. I can actually only speak to the arguments for, and then I'll explain why.
Okay.
Myself and Logan Fletcher, who's the current student body president, spoke in favor of the bill. Logan's comments were very brief. He just handed out a resolution that our students had passed in favor. And really the idea behind the tuition freeze is just looking at the financing in our state right now and realizing that we're doing pretty well, and that tuition before the previous 4 years had been going up significantly every year. And even though we've capped it the last 2 years, it still has continued to go up. And we thought that this year we could maybe freeze it just for 2 years, give students a break in their tuition. Certainly we don't want to hurt the universities in this. That is not our intention. And as I noted during my testimony today, the appropriation is not included in the bill right now because it was impossible for us to estimate what that number would be to make up the difference because of the funding models being proposed, and the higher education budget, of course, has not been finalized, so we're not sure what that'll be. And then the hearing was closed when I left, and then they had opened it, and Chancellor Scrivani had a chance to speak again after I'd left, just by a misunderstanding. And he did speak in opposition to the bill. I wasn't able to be there and hear the reasoning behind it, of course, but I can certainly understand the university system and other universities' concern with the bill. I mean, it's the same discussion we typically have with this.
Do you have any sort of ballpark figure as to what the university system would want in exchange for endorsing this freeze?
Financially?
Yes.
Yep. In 2011, when it was proposed, the fiscal note was estimated at about $25 million. And I think that was a little bit higher than what it actually would have came down to. And of course, then in 2011, we didn't end up legislatively placing a cap on tuition.
Were there any questions raised about whether this infringes on the prerogatives of the Board of Higher Education?
Not well during my testimony. I believe that was a question that might have come up during Chancellor Scrivani's.
Okay. And what has been the history of tuition increases at the four-year schools? Do you have any perspective on that for us?
I guess in 2009, the legislature did cap it at 4%. And in 2011, again, there was no legislative action, but the state board had agreed to cap it at 2.5%. And for one exception, which was NDSU, they did maintain that. And previous to that, I mean, I've heard numbers that from 2002 to 2010, I believe it was anywhere from 90 to 100% of an increase in tuition. In the 5 years that I was at UND, it increased by about $1,000 before I graduated. So
5 years, $1,000.
Over those 5 years, it increased 1,000 almost. It was a little over 900. Yep.
Okay, that's impressive. I was looking at some figures this morning, and the University of North Dakota, a annual tuition rate for 2000 and 2001 was $2,604. For the current school year, it's almost $6,000, $5,938. Dr. Scogan, you might, one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, I'll mention it right now, and I'm sure you would want to follow up on it. The two-year institutions in North Dakota have not been raising their tuition for several years. And so they already, in effect, have a tuition freeze, although it was not mandated by the legislature. The four-year schools, although the four-year schools, they have been raising their tuition within some parameters set by the legislature. This bill that Representative Overson has introduced would actually freeze tuition for 2 years. Could you just comment on whether you think that this is good policy, and as the president of a two-year school, is this really that important to you because you haven't been raising tuition anyway?
Well, first, before I answer your question, Dale and Scott, I just want you to know that I know you guys know this, but you were talking about Rough Rider Awards.
Yes.
University of Mary is one of your sponsors, and Sister Thomas Welder is a winner.
Another recipient.
Yeah.
Absolutely, a good one. Yeah.
And I know you guys knew that. You just happened to.
And being the Hettinger native, who knows? Dr. Scogan might be next.
No, I'm not going to go that far. I'm not going to go that far.
But a good reminder.
I just thought I'd throw that out there for you.
That was very, very generous of you to do that.
Let me just say to begin with is I think that everybody in higher education, I think I can speak for everybody, that we want to keep costs down. That's not an issue. But philosophically, the chancellor and, of course, the president of the state board would be in the best position to talk about this because this is well over my pay grade. But the issue, as you brought out, Dale, is what is the prerogative of the state board and the legislature in this whole process? Is it the state board that sets the rate, or is it the legislatures that set the rate? Our legislature has been so generous to higher education, and of course that means being incredibly generous to the students in the state of North Dakota. I think we can all agree to that. So from maybe either a constitutional or a legal point of view, someone can ask who has that prerogative. I think the state board, and certainly the chancellor articulated that after the representative left, that the board really has that prerogative. Now, for two-year schools, as you've already pointed out, Dale, this has worked magnificently. For the last two bienniums, the state board has proposed that, given the funding, that the two-year tuitions would be frozen. And the legislature has stepped up and has appropriated that money, and so we froze tuitions as you've pointed out, for the last 4 years. Now, the reason that we've really been focused the last 4 years, and I know in my discussions with the former chancellor, as we developed these proposals, what's gone on is that about 4 years ago, two-year college education in the state of North Dakota was 20+% higher than regional averages. And so two-year college presidents sat around and said, we've got to fix this somehow. And the only way to fix it is to freeze the tuition. And the only way you can freeze the tuition and keep up with the cost to continue and inflation and just the growing costs of education is to get that funding. And the legislature has stepped up the last two bienniums and has appropriated those dollars so that two-year colleges could freeze. We are now about 6% above the regional average. So it's worked. It's been magnificent that we've been able to draw that down. When you think about the two-year schools, the entry point for education for everybody is open enrollment, and everybody in the state should be able to get at least a two-year education. It is marvelous to be able to freeze those tuitions. So from a two-year college perspective, we've been very happy with what the legislature has done upon the recommendation, the proposals, I should say, by the State Board of Higher Ed. So right now, I think that the legislation that's put in, I don't know anybody that disagrees with the spirit of it. It's just, where should that authority lie? And the State Board and the Chancellor would say that they should make that decision. And by freezing it statutorily, you've got the problem of the flexibility, because University X may have a need to raise tuition, University Y may not, and the state board that has jurisdiction over all the institutions would be in the best position to make those calls. So by putting it into the statute, they lose that flexibility.
Representative Overson, do you think that any sort of qualms that might exist because of the prerogatives of the Board of Higher Education might go away if they were given enough money to make up for the tuition loss of the loss of tuition revenue? If
they were given the additional money, yes. No, I mean, I think the argument is still there that we are taking some authority away from the state board and making these decisions. I think part of it, though, is the accountability there, and I certainly have no ill will against anyone involved in the state board, but what we saw in 2011 after the session was that NDSU came forward afterwards and did ask for a significant increase. And I know they had a lot of supportive students. I was involved with that and knew a lot of the students who were supportive of it. But that was difficult for students across the state to see then that one university all of a sudden jumped forward, and that looks bad upon all of us, and that we weren't able to hold that 2.5% increase. So it's not trying to take the power away. It's just a guarantee that we can't raise tuition for 2 years, and that we are meeting those needs.
It's kind of like a trust but verify situation, huh?
Yeah.
Well, it's very nice if there's some sort of agreed upon voluntary guideline, but a statutory ceiling is better because it has to be enforced.
Right. And again, this is holding universities harmless. We know that I'm very supportive of higher education. I always have been. And we don't want this to be harming our universities going forward. We want to provide that additional funding to make up for the difference. So,
do you think that that's something that other members of the House recognize and sympathize with? That the idea that in exchange for a tuition freeze, that there needs to be some increase in the general fund support for colleges to make up for that?
I think so. I think a lot of our members, although there's always a cloud hanging over higher education for whatever reason, but there's a lot of, especially now with more young people in our legislature who have recently gone through the system, who have been involved with it, they are supportive of it, they are products of it, they want to support it.
How difficult is it for your your compatriots in school. I mean, I imagine you know a lot of people who graduated with significant debt. And how important is it to keep tuition down so that this doesn't happen?
Absolutely. I start paying my student loans next month. I think it's very difficult. I mean, I certainly understand the numbers that we're seeing, more than a lot of members of our legislature. And I was always working several jobs when I was there. It was by no means because I was slacking and just putting it all into student loans. It's expensive, but we want to be able to focus on our education while we're there as opposed to trying to pay for the education.
We've been speaking this evening to Representative Kylie Overson, whose voice you just heard. She is a Democrat from Grand Forks, from District 42. She represents the University of North Dakota. She's introduced legislation to freeze tuition at the colleges in North Dakota's university system for the next 2 years. We also have had Dr. Larry Scogan from Bismarck State College, the president of Bismarck State College. He pointed out, of course, that the tuition at two-year schools in North Dakota has been frozen for the last several years, so no problem there.
And enjoyable conversation.
Thank you, Scott.
Any final quick thoughts, Dr. Scogan, before we let you go?
It's going to be cold tomorrow.
That we know.
That's a thought I've got. I thought about that walking over here tonight.
Gloves, scarves, and coats.
No, just thanks for having us. I appreciate the dialogue.
All right, thank you both. Appreciate it very much. Interesting conversation that we will continue to follow without a question. And by the way, when we do come back, we're going to talk a little bit about expansion of Medicaid coverage to include poor single folks. That'll be our topic, and we'll be joined by Senator Tim Mathern, Maggie Anderson, who's the Interim Director of the North Dakota Department of Human Services, Representative Chet Pollert, as well, Chairman of the House Appropriations Human Services Subcommittee. So we will have more lively discussions to tackle after we take a break. We're live tonight at the Peacock Alley American Grill and Bar in downtown Bismarck, the site of the Legislature Today radio show, where it is Wine Down Wednesday. Don't you just love that? Wine Down Wednesday. That means all their bottles of wine, everything in their wine menu, their wine selection is 1/2 off, your choice. So a great way to go here at the Peacock Alley American Grill and Bar. This is the Legislature Today radio show on 550 K-Fire, our flagship from Bismarck, Mandan, as well as Talk Radio AM 1100 The Flag in the Valley. Talk Radio AM 1090 in the Bakken as well. Our affiliates for the Legislature Today radio show, and we'll continue after this. Don't go away. We are back at the Peacock Alley American Grill and Bar. Another half hour of the Legislature Today radio show is underway. We have three guests for the remainder of the hour, and a hot topic to tackle. And Dale Wetzel, managing editor for the Great Plains Examiner newspaper and Great Plains News, that feeds newspapers and television stations and radio stations news of the North Dakota Legislature and state government all across the great state of North Dakota, is here to introduce our guests and kick off another hot topic.
We have, thank you, Scott. We have with us this evening, we have Representative Chet Pollert, who is the chairman of the House Appropriations subcommittee that oversees the Department of Human Services budget, and also the subject that we're going to be discussing this evening, which is the possible expansion of Medicaid coverage. We have Maggie Anderson, who is the interim director of the Department of Human Services. She succeeded Carol Olson after Carol Olson retired last year, and before she became interim director of the Department of Human Services, she was the director of the Medicaid section. She knows more about Medicaid than most people. And we also have Senator Tim Mathern, a Democrat from Fargo, who is a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, is intimately familiar with the subject we're speaking of tonight. And first of all, I'd like to start with you, Ms. Anderson. Could you explain to us, please, what are we talking about when we talk about the expansion of Medicaid? What is its purpose, and why are we talking about it now?
Sure. The Medicaid expansion was included as part of the Affordable Care Act, and when the Affordable Care Act passed, it was a mandate that all states expand their Medicaid program. And then when the Supreme Court made their decision last June, they said that the expansion was constitutional, but the mandate was not. And so the reason we're talking about it is now the decision is left up to the states as to whether they'll expand their program. And if the state decides to expand its Medicaid program, essentially we would cover all adults under the age of 65, up to 138% of the federal poverty level. And the most notable piece of that is the group that's often referred to as the childless adults would be eligible for Medicaid for the first time.
Who is normally eligible for Medicaid now?
Typically, it's women, pregnant women, children, parents of dependent children, the elderly and disabled comprise, I should say, most of the Medicaid population.
And when we talk about 138% of poverty, what does that mean in terms of a person's income?
For a household of one, that is about $931 a month. And for a household of two, it is about $1,261 a month. And the reason I use 1 and 2 households is that's really the group that we think will benefit from the expansion. It really won't be your households of 3 and 4 people.
Because they are already eligible.
Generally, they have dependent children and they're already eligible.
Senator Mathern, this is a subject that you've been intensely interested in for some time. Could you tell us what is the significance of the choice that the legislature is going to be making here as to whether to expand Medicaid, and if so, who to expand it to?
I think it's historic legislation because it's the first time we're addressing the needs of the hardworking families that are out of the system. You know, we have people that have jobs without health care benefits, and they have children, but their income is such that they aren't eligible for Medicaid, so they don't have care. Right now we have the Affordable Care Act, which is going to give people opportunities to get insurance, and then we have care for the poor. This program is for those people in the middle who don't have those kinds of opportunities, and I think this legislative session, when we have all of these resources, is the prime time, the prime vehicle to expand this coverage to make sure those people are covered.
And how do you think that this will make a dent in the problem of folks going without insurance in North Dakota?
Well, right now we have people that linger on with health care problems that eventually cost more. So these people will get preventative care, will get into receiving that kind of care. We have all kinds of problems, and things like diabetes, hypertension, heart problems. All of those things cost dramatically more if people don't get care early. The other thing this is going to do, which is really important for our state, is this is going to reimburse providers, healthcare providers, doctors, hospitals, and those kinds of providers who basically now provide this care free. And when they provide this care free, they charge that to the payers of health care or those people who have insurance. So we're just transferring health care costs from one group of people to another, but this makes it more transparent, and we know now who is going to get the care, and we won't be transferring this. So it's not just good for individuals that are low income, it's good for providers, and it's good for all of us who have great health care policies, because that care won't go on to our policies.
Representative Pollert, it's your job as the chairman of the House Appropriations subcommittee on Human Services to kind of run the numbers on all of this. And what do you have any idea yet of what the numbers are and what the projections are for the future? And also, what sort of budgetary obligation would the state be taking on to expand Medicaid in the sense that has been discussed earlier?
Well, Dale, we asked for the schedules, the numbers, the eligibles, who it would be. We just received them in the hearing here today where we first saw the numbers. So to have them right at the top of my head, I don't have them all, but we're talking about a possible enrollees, if I'm correct, of anywhere from 20,400 and some individuals up to, I think, 32,500.
What's the long-term budget impact in general terms of adding that many folks to the Medicaid rolls? If I'm not mistaken, Ms. Anderson, our Medicaid rolls right now are about 60,000, 66?
About 66,000 people.
66,000 folks, and so we're talking about adding 20 to 32,000 people to that, so that's a significant percentage increase. How is the state budget going to be able to handle that?
Well, what you're seeing, as of that I understand now, with the Affordable Care Act, we're going to have what you call a woodworking effect, which is already going to happen within the next year or two. That is already in House Bill 1012, which is the bill for the Department of Human Services, and then the others will come online in 2014, and those numbers, if you look at the 20,500 people who could become eligible, that's going to be roughly $74 million a year.
And
of which, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, of which, for the first 3 or 4 years, if I'm correct, the federal government would do the 100% match on that.
Do you trust that will continue, given the federal government's rather parlous financial condition right now?
Well, Dale, I think that's why you see some consternation from our side of the aisle. Is we all know the federal government $16 trillion in debt. Are they going to be able to meet their obligations in the future? That's some of the consternation on our side. Also, with the Affordable Care Act, there will be administrative costs for us to administer that program. And so it isn't all federal dollars. It will take employees at the Department of Human Services, and there will be some costs. But basically, the spending in our federal government, I think, is where you're seeing the consternation on our side of the aisle.
When you're...
I would like to add to that, Dale.
Sure.
Essentially, the question of cost really is a question across the board. We also get federal dollars for highways. And we aren't at this time talking about not taking federal dollars for highway construction because the federal government might not be able to pay for that in the future. We are talking here about care for people. And I think to the same degree that we reach out and take those federal dollars for highways, we can reach out, take those federal dollars for health care for our citizens, for our brothers and sisters, our people in our communities, and we can share in that responsibility in the future. If the federal government can't pay for this bill, then we have to deal with what are other ways we can do this. But essentially, it would be unjust for us not to take this money, but take money for highways. The bottom line is people are important. We all benefit when people get health care.
We hear a lot about that, the comparison that you just made about highways and how we try to vacuum up maximum federal dollars for highways. But when you fix a highway, the chances are, at least this is the hope, that it'll stay fixed for about 15, 20 years. If you fix a human being's health care problems, who knows if they'll have more.
For 70 years.
Yeah, okay. Who knows if they'll have more in the next 6 months. I mean, is that really a valid comparison?
Oh, health care investments in children has a lifetime benefit. It has more benefit than a road. So, Dale, try to remember here, you're trying to provide a fair forum here.
Of course.
And for you to get on the side that this is maybe a negative, it's just going down the wrong road.
Oh, I wasn't trying to do that. I was just trying to...
Well, you were implying that, Dale.
Well, I don't agree, but that's okay. We'll argue about that later. Representative Pollert, when you're sitting there listening to all this information, what is going through your head in terms of, your impressions of what the effects of this will be?
We deal with the Department of Human Services budget every day. Our section of House Appropriations starts this about 2 days after the session starts, and we're going through the detail. These are numbers in the whole spectrum of a $2.8 billion budget. So this is just one aspect. But the reason it was pulled off into a separate bill, it's a different whole section of the Department of Human Services that is new for us to be doing because of the Affordable Care Act. And that's why the bill was pulled off, because the leadership on the House side thought that the bill should have its own hearing and not be done in a detailed section the way we do it on House Appropriations. And that's why it was a public hearing today for both the Policy Committee on Human Services and for the section of Appropriations to hear the testimony as well.
Ms. Anderson, what are the administrative challenges, if that's the word, that are presented by this issue? I mean, is it that big of a deal for the department in terms of, expanding Medicaid, providing health insurance for more folks? Is that particularly complex, or are there factors at play here that we haven't talked about yet?
Sure. It's not necessarily complex. It would be an expansion of some of the duties that we have now. As you mentioned, with an estimated enrollment increase of somewhere between 20,000 and 32,000, that's a significant percentage increase of our current enrollment. And so those items that our staff do that are transaction-based, such as utilization review or prior authorization of a service or processing of a claim, those transactions that staff have to do as part of their work will increase with an increase in enrollment. And so we provided options to the committee today during our testimony, and it really depends on which direction they would like to go with health care coverage should they decide to authorize the expansion. If we had a coverage program that looked a lot like the Medicaid program today, we would actually need more staff, again, to handle that increased transaction than we would if they chose to do coverage that looked more like private insurance that people could access through the exchange, and then the state would pay for that coverage for them. So there are different administrative costs. They're not particularly challenging, just a recognition that there would be additional work.
What is Medicaid like as an insurance plan? What kind of benefits do you get?
The Medicaid program in North Dakota is fairly comprehensive. There are, at the federal level, mandatory services, and then there are optional services, and North Dakota's plan covers many of the optional services. But, for example, we cover hospitalization services, physician services, dental, optometric, therapies such as physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. We cover lab and x-ray, non-emergency medical transportation, ambulance services. So it's a fairly comprehensive plan.
Would you describe it as a good plan? I mean, if it was being offered by a private insurance company, for example, would people say, boy, that's a good plan?
It is a good plan. And again, like the non-emergency medical transportation is something that's fairly unique to Medicaid. Again, because we have low-income and disabled individuals qualifying for our program, we have an obligation to assist them in accessing services. So that non-emergency medical transportation isn't a benefit you'd often see in a private insurance coverage.
Senator Mathern, you've described previously the option of having private insurance companies provide this Medicaid benefit to the folks that we're talking about who would be affected by this. Could you just elaborate on that a bit?
I think we could simplify this thing so much by buying a Blue Cross Blue Shield policy for people eligible for the program. Let's just buy an insurance policy for someone, and then they use that policy just like all the citizens in this state who have insurance. It would be a simpler way to administer the program for the state. Essentially, the administration would go out to the private market. It would help the individuals receiving the care be treated like anyone else who has insurance, and it would help low-income families begin to understand the concepts of working with private insurance, because most of these people, we're hoping that someday get a job that has some benefits. So the goal for this program is not for these people to be on the program forever. It's really for them to be on the program during those months, or maybe for some people years, when they don't have the proper income or their employer can't pay for an insurance product. So to get them ready for that day when they have insurance is positive. So I think there's a couple ways to go, and I appreciate that the Department of Human Services kind of outlined those two ways of doing it, either government providing the administration or a private insurance company doing it. I hope the House makes a decision in that regard, sends over the bill, defeats Carlson's bill. Passes the bill in terms of having it's kind of interesting. He introduces a bill to expand Medicaid and then suggests people vote against it. I mean, that's as backwards as we get in the legislature. If he really wanted this program, he ought to introduce a bill that's for it and then testify for it. He introduces a bill and then testifies against it. It's just convoluted. And so I hope they in fact pass the bill over his testimony, make a good decision. I'm sure Representative Pollert can make a good decision about whether this should be insurance or administered by Maggie Anderson's department. We bring that over to the Senate, dust it up a little bit, and send it to the governor and get it going.
What do you think about that analysis, Representative Pollert?
Well, Tim and I don't agree all the time. I agree.
Most of the time.
We do agree quite a bit, but in this particular instance, I agree with Majority Leader Al Carlson to separate the bill out and have its own hearing. Actually, I wished we had more time to deal with the bill because there was no talk that I knew of during the pre-session if this section, which is Section 3, I think, in House Bill 1012, and now is the House bill, we could have had a discovery phase here better than where we're at now because we're trying to cram all this information into about a 3-week period. And so I agree with Representative Carlson that it needs to have its own day. I don't want to say in court. It already had that, but so that both sides can talk about it. We'll see what the House is going to do. Right now, if the bill comes forward in the House, if the bill is by itself, I have a concern that if I brought the Department of Human Services budget on the floor with this section in 1012, I don't think it would pass right now. And I think it was a good situation for Majority Leader Carlson to put it into the bill or to have a separate bill so the discussion is had.
What do you I'd like Senator Mathern and Representative Pollert especially to respond to this. To what extent do you think that this whole issue is, frankly, somewhat in a cocked hat from the beginning because this is part of Obamacare? The Republican caucus in North Dakota has campaigned against the Affordable Care Act / Obamacare from the beginning. Democrats have been supportive of it. The Supreme Court upheld it as constitutional. Now here it is. We must deal with it, but it seems that there is this kind of spillover from previous when Republicans, Obamacare bad, Democrats, Obamacare good, and it's almost like the merits of a particular proposal aren't being talked about if it's linked in somehow to Obamacare. People just line up depending on whether it's Obamacare or not, rather than what the merits of the proposal might be.
Well, I think that the values of the people in our state are we care for one another. We aren't going to shoot people that are sick. We aren't going to kick them out in the street. We're going to care for them. And this is an opportunity to actually work that out in the public policy. I think I think there is an ideological divide regarding Barack Obama that is being played out here. But we'll get over that. And the bottom line is we have an opportunity to serve these citizens. We have an opportunity to do it in such a way that the federal government is helping us do that. And I think the House has got to get this out of its system about Obama. They'll probably kill the bill so that they'll have a vote against Obamacare. They'll feel real good about it. That's part of the process here. And then we'll get to work and try to figure out how to serve the individuals. And I think Representative and I will work out those details in a conference committee.
What do you think about that analysis, Representative Pollert?
Well, Dale, I think you have to remember, and during the campaign season, if you take a straw poll of people in North Dakota, roughly 60-65% of North Dakotans don't like the Affordable Care Act. And I think that's why you're seeing this consternation on the House Republican side as far as that bill, what was going on. We're not questioning whether services should be there. Are we getting at the core people? I think it's questionable if you can say, are we doing the right amount of care for the right group of people? I think that's a legitimate question. Are the hospitals, let's say this as an example. So a person goes into the hospital, or Blue Cross, Blue Shield would be part of this as well. And I asked the question in the committee today. So they have insurance. They have revenues coming in because of the federal share. So that tells me then the taxpayers of North Dakota should get a lower bill if the private pay goes in to that hospital for a service. I don't see that happening. Yeah. Same way with Blue Cross Blue Shield. They said today their insurance policies are $100 a month is what they charge for the uninsured. So the next question would be, okay, so if you do affordable health care, will Blue Cross Blue Shield drop their health insurance by $100? The normal taxpayer in North Dakota doesn't see that happening. And that's why they're revolting and have I think, with the consternation with the Affordable Care Act.
This will be a really interesting debate to have as we go forward. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to wrap this up, and Tim is smiling ruefully over in the corner there, and I know that he can talk about this all night long, and it's quite informative to listen to him do it as well. We have Maggie Anderson, the Interim Director of the Department of Human Services. We have Representative Chet Pollert, whose voice you just heard. He's a Republican from Carrington, the Chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Human Services. And we have Senator Tim Mathern, a Democrat from Fargo, member of the Senate Appropriations Committee. Thank you all for showing up. This has been very enlightening, I think.
All right, folks, another hour. The legislature today is in the book. Speaking, by the way, of Obamacare, I want to recognize one of our sponsors, very concerned about some of the things in Obamacare, Concerned Women for America, North Dakota chapter, one of our sponsors of the Legislature Today radio show. We thank them for their sponsorship of the program as well. You can find out more about them at cwa.org, cwa.org. All right, we'll take a break, and thank you for listening again to the Legislature Today radio show.